Well, welcome, Alison Littlewood. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me along.
That's okay. You've written quite a few books, haven't you, in short stories? How would you define your writing style?
Oh my goodness, like hardest question first. It's yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, I've always been drawn to darker ideas, or at least once I started writing, I was. Um, so I mean, some of my novels fall cleanly into the horror camp, some are more dark fantasy, some have got crime elements. I mean, I use folklore and fairy tale quite a lot. So I
Hmm.
tend to be crossing genres and blurring genres a little bit and probably making it quite difficult for publishers to decide which shelf to stick me on. And I mean, more recently, I mean, I've done quite a bit of historical stuff set in Victorian times, and um, my latest books really tend to be just badged as mainstream fiction,
Yeah, yeah.
because I think the publishers feel that they got sort of quite broad appeal. They're not really horror, you know. I might do ghost stories, but it's an area that they tend to hope will be out on the shelves at the front of the shop and not at the back. But fortunately, when I write, I don't kind of have to think about that stuff. And I don't find it very helpful to think about that stuff either. I think when I'm sitting down to just try and write the best story that I can, I can't be thinking I'm doing this for a certain market or a certain
No,
readership or a category. I don't like to think of it in those terms.
yeah,
I just kind of follow the ideas really and see where they lead me, and just write what I find interesting and hope that eventually it'll find a place
yeah.
later on. That's
So,
that's the hope.
so, where did your love of fiction begin? You know, were you a reader as a kid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always shared a love of books with my mum, and she had me reading before I went to school.
Hmm.
I read Alice in Wonderland when I was 5, so that
Oh,
was
wow.
quite, you know, I suppose I was quite an advanced reader for my age, really, and just devoured books, read everything I could get my hands on. I wasn't particularly, um, you know, a reader specifically of dark fiction back then. I'd just like to read
Yes.
all sorts of stuff, lots of classics and things like that. So it was when I started to write that I kind of began to hone that and read more within the genre or
Yeah, yeah.
genres.
Well, you're similar age to myself, I think. So I've got this theory that we were quite sort of damaged as kids because of all the the
Yeah.
public information films about the ones like Apache and the was it called Dark and Lonely Water, that one as well, something like
Yes, that's the one that always sticks in my mind as well. Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And the Charlie ones were odd, even though they weren't kind of that specifically scary. There's something very weird about that. In fact, a guy called Neil Williamson's just done a novella called Charlie Says around those films, and it's really good.
One day when my dad went fishing, he took Charlie and me along. While he was fishing, we started having fun with the puddles. Dad shouted, "Come back here!" But just then, Charlie tried to do an extra big jump, and he went over the edge and into the water. Charlie nearly drowned. It was very lucky for him, he caught on the line. Charlie says next time we go fishing, we should stay very close to Dad, where he can look after us. And he hopes that when you go near the water, you'll stay close to a grown-up too.
Well, even things like the cartoons. I mean, Watership Down as well. I mean, I remember watching it as a kid, and you wouldn't show that to kids now. I don't think it's too dark and disturbing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and some of the stories that I fell in love with first,
Mm.
you read them now and they're more shocking for you as an adult to read. I mean, some of the Hans Christian Andersen stuff, You know, I adored The Little Mermaid when I was younger, and it made me cry every time I read it, but I just loved it anyway. But I mean, if you read something like The Red Shoes now, that's really kind of,
Yeah.
that's like quite horrifying stuff. But as a child, I suppose you take it all in and accept everything you read, and then you just close the page and it's safely put away, and you know it's in a land far, far away kind of thing. But
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean,
perhaps, yeah.
so I was going to say, I used to live in America, and I showed some of the people over there, some of the kids programs like Children of the Stones as well. You know, just the intro itself. If you remember that really haunting sort of vocals and scary stones zoomed in and out, and that sort of.
No, I don't remember that one.
Oh, you
No,
don't remember that? Oh,
no.
that's you should
Probably
watch
a good
that.
job. I might have been more warped than I am now.
So when did you start writing then? What got you into writing?
I mean, aside from I always kind of wrote when I was a kid, but then I don't know, that thing happens when you're a teenager, I think, and you
Yeah,
put all that stuff away. And I always kept on with books. I've
yeah,
always kept my love of books, but I kind of start to think that authors were these weird otherworldly beings that were on a pedestal somewhere. So I didn't think about writing myself. I suppose deep down I had a secret dream of, you know, one day having a book with my name on the cover. But
yeah,
I was in my 30s, I think, and
yeah.
just, you know, going to work every day and thinking, what else is there? You know, and having this secret dream and loving these books. And I just eventually thought, you know what, give it a go or shut up to yourself, you know, or put the dream away because, you know, try it or and just see what happens. So I forced myself just to join a local writing class,
Hmm.
and I was lucky. I got a really nice, supportive one, and just started out just doing little vignettes and poems. I'm afraid to admit, and it went from there. Really, I didn't kind of stop since. Started writing
Yeah,
short stories, started being drawn to darker ideas, and then eventually thought I want to write something longer and started
yeah.
drafting novels. Yeah.
How much planning do you put into a story before you actually start writing, would you say?
Um, my short stories can be fairly well planned, and I tend to have an idea, like just a feeling of what the final moments of a story are going to be and how I
Yeah,
want the reader to feel, and I write towards that. Um, with novels, I tend to have you know, the first 10,000 words, the last 10,000 words. I kind of roughly know what's going to happen in those. It's that big bit in the middle. I I've actually tried writing one where I planned it all out to the nth degree, which was going against the grain really. And when I wrote it, it felt like an artist suddenly having to do a painting by numbers.
yeah. I know
And
what you mean.
every word just seemed to come out dead on the page. And I finished it and I just binned it straight away. Thought that that's not me, because even though it's kind of painful to write without a plan, because there's always days when you sit down and you've got beyond where you know what's going to happen. It's like, ah, and you know, you're just banging your head against a wall. But that's also where the interesting stuff starts to happen.
Yeah,
Um, because I'll realize that there are things going on in my book that I never planned. And, you know, when readers say to me, God, that bit in that book really took me by surprise, it's actually because it took me by surprise as well. And it's great when that happens, when you realize there's a whole swathe of stuff kind of beyond what you'd imagined.
yeah. I like the characters in your books. How much do you give them head in terms of like if they start developing past the point where you sort of imagined them originally? Do you start letting them sort of go in their own direction? You know, if they've started to grow into that sort of, you know, in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of hope that they'll do that and take some of the heat off me when it comes to plots. Yeah, yeah. It's nice when uh, it doesn't tend to happen so much in short stories. I mean, sometimes it does, but in a longer piece, it's nice where you find yourself putting something in and kind of. Well, I think of it as opening a thread of story, and you actually don't quite know why it's there, but you go with it.
Yeah.
And it's funny how your subconscious just weaves things together or picks things up and takes them in a slightly different, more interesting direction. And sometimes it doesn't go anywhere and you have to just go back and sort it out and take that character out, put in it, who actually then just vanishes. But you can sort that out in the editing. It's kind of interesting to open those threads and then just see what loops back and what weaves into other things. And it's where interesting stuff happens.
Yeah, for definite. Yeah. I like the way that when I'm reading your books, they're always set in a solid place, obviously, So there was like the Maitland Farm and the school as well. I just read your last book as well. So do you plan it in such a way that you've got like a floor plan of the buildings and such, so that you can remember where people? I mean, how far do you take it?
You know what? I really wish I did. In fact, I went to a seminar by Michelle Paver, who wrote Dark Matter, and it was really interesting. She brought along some of her notes, and she does quite meticulous floor plans of all the buildings. And I thought, I do that because I have. I mean, sometimes I'll have people with like stairs going up from the lounge, and then later it's like I'm talking about them living in a flat. Honestly, because I'll just write that kind of off the cuff, and I have to go back and think, no, where exactly does she live? It does create problems with yourself. So yeah, I tend to think I should just do floor plans and things. But yeah, at some stage you have to think about, exactly what kind of house somebody would live in and how it's laid out and everything, and go back and sort all the thorny little problems out that you've created for yourself. So yeah, things like that, and timelines I should do, but it's a balance just between over plotting for me and just getting in the zone and going with the flow. I mean, I've just written a piece where I've realized partway through that somebody lives in a terrace and not on a housing estate, and I've had to go back. But once it's quite nice. It's like a photograph gradually coming into focus. When you start sorting those things out, it feels like things are really slotting into place. And but I do tend to do a lot of editing. I'll spend probably more time editing than I do on drafting, a lot more, really. And that's part of the reason.
So when you say editing, what I mean, do you try to, because I know some writers try to get the most sort of optimized sentence as possible, don't they? I don't really see that in your work. How do you go about editing? Is it just a case of making sure everything makes sense, basically?
The structural edit is, tucking in the threads, sorting out any messy bits, things that don't quite tie up. But I mean, I line by line edit a lot as well. Because I mean, there's an immediacy in a first draft, and sometimes you read things and you think, do you know what, that's pretty much right, just because you're in the flow and you feel that kind of, the spirit of the thing really comes through, and you don't want to edit that away. But equally, sometimes I'm kind of so into a scene, like I can write a scene and then realize I've written it so that a reader wouldn't even know what's going on, because I've assumed all that stuff, because I know all that stuff and I haven't put it on the page. So it's a bit of both. I work on prose quite a lot as well. I suppose it's just a part of the craft. I really value that stuff. I want things to flow and read smoothly, and I want to come up with imagery that's very specific and not generic, and that tries to really put the reader on the spot. And it's about creating atmosphere as well. It's what's so important in dark fiction, the atmosphere and description. And I think the rhythm of prose is really important. I don't know if people tend to think about that so much, but I tend to think of it in terms of music almost. If I'm building to some sort of climax in a scene, then the whole rhythm of the prose has to kind of support that. So I do work on all that stuff quite meticulously afterwards.
I've noticed you use weather a lot as well, to create atmosphere. I like that.
Well, I set quite a lot of stuff in Yorkshire where I live. So, I like to use little gloomy corners of it and really, yeah, throw a bit of dreariness onto the page now and then.
Well, I've noticed as well that you must do a lot of research. And I mean, do you do specialist research, or are you just naturally well read in history? Have you got an history interest?
I mean, I did my degree. It was a joint English and history, so yeah, I've always
Ah,
kind of had an interest. But to be honest, when I first started coming up with ideas that I felt would be suited to Victorian times, it was a bit of a problem because knowing a bit just makes you realize how much you don't know.
mm,
And I always like to just start writing and get in the flow, and just the first draft I tend to try and write quite quickly. But with the Victorian stuff, I kind of think, well, okay, I need to get my character out of bed in the morning and get them to work. Not that you go into that, you don't want to
yeah,
bore the reader with all that detail, but at the same time, not even knowing how a character might get up and have a wash and get the breakfast, all of that sort of stuff, it is a bit stymieing, really, as a writer. You don't want to just be stopping every 2 minutes to look at most basic stuff. So before I even began that, I just read oodles of things about everyday Victorian life. My first Victorian book was set on a farm, so it was lots of stuff about Victorian farming and how things would be run. Ruth Goodman's books are brilliant on this because she wrote a book called it's How to Be a Victorian, where she doesn't just research it and tell you how things used to be done. She will get old Victorian clothing, take it apart, cut similar pieces of fabric, and she'll stitch them by hand like they used to do, and she'll wear
wow,
them for a month. She wore corsets for a month, so she
that's
can
awesome.
describe what it was like taking it off at the end of the day, how it made us sore, how it made us sit, and what it was like after a month, and how she kind of got used to it, and how that feeds into an understanding of that very upright Victorian postures. And it's actually really easy to sit like that if you can't really sit any other way in a corset, and all that sort of detail. So
Yeah,
sorry, it's a bit of a long answer, but yeah, I did all that before I started to write,
yeah,
and then researched some specific stuff like about the Crystal Palace and what was on display and things like
yeah,
that. But then it was a case of seeing what came up and delving more into specific questions then
yeah,
that came up. Yeah,
yeah. It's
but yeah,
interesting
I did
though.
absolutely loads of research, particularly for the Hidden People, because that was the first one. And then the Crow Garden brought in loads of stuff about the history of spiritualism and seances, and but also physicians and doctoring and anesthetics, and so many different threads came into it. I cannot tell you how much I was cursing myself with that one. Like how to double your workload as a writer, just do something historical. It'll at least double your workload.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I've written some guidebooks, and they're not fiction. It's basically guidebooks about computer games, right? And
Right.
what I found is I've had to actually take my email address off my website because you get all these people that they'll find a fault. It's like a tiny little thing that's wrong, and
Right.
they'll get in touch, and I call it the "Oh come on man" emails
Yeah.
because they're absolutely flabbergasted that you didn't know there was a computer game. Just really briefly, there was a computer game that yeah I didn't even write. I'm just writing about it. F-15A Eagle or something like that it was called, right? And the picture on the cover, which I didn't make, it was a published game, wasn't that type of aeroplane. It was slightly different, and it
No.
was someone contacted me like I was responsible for it and pointed it out. So, oh come on, man! It's like sorry.
Yeah, I didn't actually do that bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can imagine. Has anyone ever got in touch with you and done a similar sort of thing and pointed out any inaccuracies or anything like that?
They actually haven't. And I
Oh,
was waiting for it, because there's that thing that, okay, you can do any amount of research, but there's still those things that you don't know,
yeah,
if
yeah.
you see what I mean. But I remember getting a review for The Hidden People from the Historical Novel Society, and it was really
Oh,
good. It said, oh,
yeah.
it's done the prose really well, because it's kind of Victorian-esque prose as well. So I was just like,
you, you passed the
biggest
test.
relief. Yeah.
Well, I know you've
I mean,
you
there's bound to
well,
be something, but
oh, well, you can't help it, can you? You know, there's going to be something in there, but so long as everybody misses it, that's it.
yeah, yeah, just hope they miss it as well.
Yeah. I know you delve into a lot of folklore as well. So have you got a natural interest in that at all?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just that being slightly obsessed with stories. So going to different places, it's great that, it's like unearthing these little treasures, and it's like there are stories buried in the ground all around us.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing I'm working on at the moment, which I'm kind of not supposed to talk about too much, but it's very much around folklore in the Peak District. And
Right.
yeah, going and visiting there and spending time there did feel like, that it was kind of laid into the ground like sediment, and
Mm.
percolating through the hills. And yeah, there's this wonderful sense of stories under our feet. And I just love that.
Yeah. Because you said one in Cottingley, didn't you? As well.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes, I did. Yeah.
have you always been intrigued by that story about the fairies?
Yeah, completely. My mum took me to the Multimedia Museum in Bradford,
Yeah.
and we saw the cameras. I think I was probably about 12 or something. Yeah, so it always, I mean, it's just that odd thing. The Victorians are wonderful for weird things like that, aren't they? But I love how you could get a rationalist like Arthur Conan Doyle, who, was convinced that these girls had captured fairies on camera. But then
Yeah.
when you start delving into it, his approach wasn't all that dissimilar to Sherlock Holmes. Excuse me, in that
Sorry.
he felt that, doing research into, a spiritual plane through, because he had that interest in spiritualism as well, and he felt that this was also where the fairies kind of dwelled. He kind of felt like he was being a rationalist, because he lived in a society where he went to church and believed in the afterlife, and he was like, okay, well, let's try and contact it then, and
Yeah.
let's use technologies that are coming through like photography to try and capture this realm that we haven't yet been able to see, but it might be like, the visible spectrum, we can only see a certain part of it, and perhaps these
Yeah.
beings live in the part that we can't see, just like microscopes, I say, so I say microscopes. Microscopes have been invented, and they could see that there was suddenly all these tiny organisms in water that had never been suspected. So
Yeah.
there was kind of a rational approach to it and a logic. So, it's easy from our standpoint to look at Arthur Conan Doyle and laugh, and a lot of people in his own time laughed at him, but
Mm.
that's the interesting thing about history. It's casting yourself back and putting yourself not just in a different time and place, it's a different mindset and a different stage along the development of thought
Yeah.
and belief as well. I'm always interested in why people kind of choose to believe in certain things, and where that comes from, and how far it's spiritual and how far it's just practical and pragmatic. And so yeah, that incident of the Cottingley fairies was instantly really interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah, weaving a story around it was great, because it fed into folklore as well, because obviously the kind of Victorian flower fairies and the kind of fairies that the little girls were picturing were very, they're the pretty little girls in dresses with gauzy wings, that kind of fairy. But in older threads of folklore, there are much darker, sort of wicked little creatures who actually got called the good folk as sort of a euphemism, so that people wouldn't upset them by telling what they felt to be the truth about them, which was that they were tricksters, they stole your kids, they did terrible things to people, and
Yeah.
they were as perilous as they were magical, really. So yeah, so bringing those threads together was quite an intriguing thing to do. That kept me occupied for quite a while.
So I know you said that you plan your stories in a way where you know the sort of beginning, the end. Um, do you? Cause you're one of the few authors where I've been reading your stories, and I know obviously there's going to be a twist coming up, right? But I can normally spot them and I never have with yours. I think you're very good at throwing the reader, so I think, I know what's going to come. I know what's going to come, right? And then it's something completely different, or it's something like I imagine, but with a twist on that as well.
Right, oh,
So,
that's another kind of my work
yeah,
here is done. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I can say that is because things took me by surprise as well.
yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I try. Yeah,
So
no,
where
I
did
mean, even when, I know kind of the beginning and the end, I'll tend to know a few milestones along the way, and if there's going to be a big change
yeah.
around. But I mean, my latest book, the other Lives of Miss Emily White, that was one that kind of, I wrote it and then it didn't feel right, and it didn't feel right, and it was about 6 months after I'd written it that I thought the book wasn't really about what I thought it was about, and there was a whole other raft of stuff at the end that
Hmm.
was going to happen. So that was
Yeah.
one that, yeah, suddenly you think, no, it's actually more than I thought it was. And it's, I mean, it was pain because I had to rewrite the whole book essentially, but it's kind of really nice when that happens as well. And
Yeah.
you just think this could actually be more interesting than I thought it was to now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the one I literally just finished that 2 days ago. And the
Right.
other one, I didn't get onto your short stories. I did read Mistletoe as well, and I thought that was great as well. And I love that. So they're quite slow burning, and I mean that in a nice way because you're very good at building up tension slowly, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, Mistletoe's a ghost story as well that I was picturing in the kind of vein of the BBC ghost stories that kind of level of spookiness and that kind of building of atmosphere and creepiness. And
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, it was quite consciously sort of put in that sort of vein. But yeah, I think ghost stories, and they're all about the atmosphere, aren't they, really? So yeah,
Yeah.
I like to
How
build
did you
the
get your first? Sorry to interrupt you. How did you get your first stories published?
Oh gosh, that's going back. So I mean, yeah, I started off with short stories,
Yeah.
and just, I guess, spending quite a lot of hours researching what was out there, and starting off with things like uh, free online magazines and anthologies that had open calls, and just sort of building from there. And trying to get into publications like Black Static, which is it's closed now, which is a shame. But you start to get a feel for ones that have got a really good reputation, and set a
Mhm.
target to get in there, and then hopefully think that hope my name's out there enough that people will start asking me for, because some anthologies, they're closed to invitations. You have to get invited by the editor, and when the first one of those happen, that's like another milestone, and you just keep aiming for the next thing and the next thing, and build a reputation, and yeah,
Yeah.
and hopefully, and keep learning and improving all the time. I think that's the main thing, really. Is I always just felt very open to learn, and I would write stuff and throw it away if I wasn't happy, but I always felt like it taught me something,
Yeah.
and just, yeah, I think it's quite important to never, I mean, I've probably got 10 novels out there now, but I never kind of feel like I've done. I can't remember who who said the quote, but someone said, you never learn to write a novel, you learn to write the novel you're writing. And I think that's very true.
Very
If
good.
you
Yeah.
write quite different things each time as well, particularly, then you've got to sort of find your way through each one. Um, and you're always setting new problems for yourself. So yeah, it's
Mm.
just aiming for one milestone after the next, I guess, to get established, and then yeah, but
Yeah.
then kind of not done. I don't know if that's probably like really bad bad news, but
Well, you certainly got a good reputation. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned, but it was Ramsey Campbell that recommended that I speak to you. So he's obviously a reader of your books.
that's real nice. Yeah, I read Ramsey's stuff as well, and actually, that was one of my milestones along the way when I was writing short stories. The first reading that I did was in Waterstone's Liverpool One, and it came about because I had a story in Black Static, and Black Static put this event on and did a little showcase of their writers. And I think there was Joel Lane was there, the late Joel Lane, unfortunately, and Conrad Williams. But Ramsey came along and he was sitting in the front row, and it was like,
right.
that's amazing, but no pressure there. Yeah. So yeah, I've known Ramsey for quite a long time now. He's really supportive to new people and a lovely guy.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? So whereabouts do you think your writing's heading next, and when can we expect the new project out?
Okay. Oh, right. Yeah, there's exciting things kind of going on behind the scenes. I've signed a contract with the publisher for it. But it's going to be quite a long lead up, this one. They've scheduled it for 2026. So we're probably not going to make an announcement until next year. So I'm kind of having to put it on the news. But yeah, things are happening, and it's really nice. It's found a good home. So yeah, this is the one that's it's kind of a blend of folklore with psychological suspense, but then there are kind of crime elements and all sorts of, fairy tale-ish things going on. So I've definitely blended some genres in this one. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let us know. Let us know nearer the time, and we'll maybe do a feature for you.
Yeah, oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the chat. It's been really fascinating. Thank you. We've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me along. That was great.
All right. Thanks. Well, you take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.